All right, everybody, welcome into Fourth and Goal. I'm the Maple Mango. Today is June 23rd of 2022, and let's get right into it. This week, I'm a little behind schedule here, so we're combining this week's post view with week two's preview. Hopefully, we'll get back on schedule for week two's games, and we can get the post view out a couple days after the games are played, and then get the preview for week three out a couple days prior to the actual week three games being played. So, starting off, we just witnessed the first week of games, and unshockingly, many of those teams we thought would shine did not. Preseason polls are, always iffy. But let's look into just how wrong we got some of these, and of course, we'll look into some of that we got right so far. So starting off, let's go to Los Angeles, California at the Coliseum, where number 20, USC, took down number 13, Texas. Pull up this graphic here. Originally, I had made my prediction. I thought USC was going to win this game despite not being the favorite. I had USC 24, Texas 20. And as we saw, and as you can see on the screen right now, that is not what happened. USC toppled the Longhorns 35-17. They just splattered Texas live. So where did it go wrong for Texas? So Texas quarterback Teddy Givens, he threw for 272 yards at a 71.8% completion rate. This included 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. You go and look at his rushing stats. He had, I believe, 10 carries and just picked up 82 yards, which is pretty impressive, averaging 8.2. But like we had said in the Texas team preview, he did have some trouble holding on to that football. That ball security was not that strong. He could not hold on to the football to save his life. He fumbled it 2 times. So you already have 3 of the 4 turnovers being because of the Longhorns quarterback. I believe the last one was a fumble by one of the running backs at some point throughout the game. So as you can see, he had some decent stats. I mean, 71.8% completion rate is awesome. It really is. 2 touchdowns, again, that's really good. But 3 turnovers by your quarterback alone is just not where it should be. Really, that's just the only way. That's the only way to phrase it. That's just a very, very bad situation for your quarterback to have to be in, and especially some questions to answer. And hopefully, that gives them something to prove, something to step up before their next games. And we'll go ahead and jump over to Southern Cal's quarterback, Axel Moon. He threw for 356 yards. That's 72.5% completion rate. So he has more yards, higher percentage completion rate. 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and only 1 rush for 7 yards. More touchdowns, 1 more interception. Overall, a better stat line, but the 2 interceptions, those are both of the turnovers for USC. So you have 75% of the turnovers by Texas quarterback, 100% of the turnovers by USC's quarterback. It's just something to look at. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think Axel Moon was much better for USC than Teddy Givens was for Texas. I believe both of them are very capable. I believe both of them are very capable at leading these teams to, at the very least, a bowl appearance, but I would not be shocked to see both of them in the playoffs, to be honest. I know Texas has a rough time in the Big 12. There's some good teams in there. You got Baylor, you got Kansas. Oklahoma looked decent after facing off against Alabama. I mean, there's a lot going on in the Big 12. And then USC, the Pac-12 doesn't look super strong right now, but you never know who might show up in the later season. So we'll just have to see if both of these teams maybe make a playoff run. I believe they can do it. But now let's go into the future of USC specifically. I still think they can make a playoff run, but they had a much better running game because of one guy, Cooper Hunter. He is injured right now. Texas, he just didn't make it through that game. He's out until week 4. They have their backup running back, Barnett. He's an okay backup, but he put up the same numbers as Hunter did in like double the time or something crazy. Hunter put up an amazing stat line until he got out of the game, and Barnett tried to replace him but didn't do that. not as exceptional as a job, which you would expect from a backup. As far as the defense goes, I would say both teams put up a decent defense. I believe the score at the half was USC 14, Texas 10. Um, and then Texas just fell apart. They scored a touchdown. They led 17-14, um, I believe. And then they never scored any points again. Um, and USC scored 3 unanswered touchdowns. Um, and yeah, ultimately they ended up winning 35-17. The Longhorns never put up any more points. So the last thing I want to look at by these teams is their punting. The averages are awful. Like, they're just bad. I don't think there's any way to look around this. The punting average for Texas, 28.5. Punting average for USC, 29.3. Now, Texas might be low because they actually did kick it out of bounds here and there. I think the accuracy wasn't where they wanted it to be, but they were trying to kick it out of bounds. It didn't go as far as they wanted to, but that was the intent. USC, they were keeping it inbounds, and it was not going that far. I don't know if they just have a bad punter. I don't know what's going on with USC. It was just, it was bad. I don't know if that's something they're going to work on. If that was just a one-game thing. If that's maybe a puncher they need to get replaced ASAP. But overall, this game was good, especially until the half. You know, we weren't sure who would come out on top. Both teams ranked, of course. You got number 20 USC, number 13 Texas. Game of the week. And both of them just had a performance in the first half, by the way, that I thought would deem them worthy of rankings. And then USC took off. Texas fell apart second half. I don't know which one it was more of, either Texas falling apart, USC stepping it up. Whatever happened, Texas ended up getting splattered. And now we have some questions about Texas. We have a couple questions about USC, but that's based off of injury pretty much alone. USC didn't jump up nearly as much as I had imagined they would have in the polls. They went from rank 20 to rank 16, I believe. After beating number 13 Texas. Miami moved from 25 to 15 after beating Army by 4. So we'll just have to see how this adjusts. Maybe it'll adjust itself in the post week 2. But anyway, let's move past the game of the week. Let's go ahead and look at some other ranked losses here. So, of course, we have Texas getting knocked out. But we have number 4, North Texas. They lost to Vanderbilt 10-17 at home. They didn't get knocked out of the rankings. The graphic that you see on screen is all the teams that got pushed out of the rankings. They dropped to rank 19. I don't know if North Texas had any real flaws in their game. They definitely got outplayed. They definitely didn't have the offense we saw them. 10 points in 4 quarters. I don't know. Maybe Vanderbilt has a super lockdown defense. Maybe Vanderbilt is just really good. Maybe Texas might not be truly great this season. And maybe Vanderbilt end up ranked. Who knows what the dynamic between these two teams was. But there's going to be a little bit of a tough time in the SEC. We'll cover the SEC later. But Vanderbilt, if they are going to get ranked, they have a gauntlet to run. They have teams like Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia, all with early hype. And if they live up to it, not to mention Arkansas, if they live up to that hype, they're going to have a tough time in the SEC. Like I said, we'll talk about them in a little bit here. So just be ready for when we talk about these guys. Moving on, we have Purdue, who also stayed ranked. They got upset at home by Mississippi State, 17-24. Very bitter loss for Purdue. Ranked 10. They dropped to rank 24. But I can immediately point a finger and say Leo Fletcher, their quarterback, heavily underperformed. I think he has the talent, and it might have just been a bad game. But the performance just wasn't to the level anyone had thought it would be. Mississippi State, they look like a pretty solid team themselves, and while they aren't ranked yet, it might be a possibility in the future. Remember, they do have to deal with the SEC. Have to see how that goes. Like I said, Purdue's loss dropped them to rank 24. I think they're very, very fortunate to be considered in the polls at all right now, dropping from rank 10 24. I mean, that's a big drop, right? 14 ranks. But then you consider teams like Texas losing to a ranked team and they got dropped. SMU. We'll get into SMU, but I don't know. I think Purdue, they need a win. Actually, I don't think a win right now. It's likely not enough to keep them ranked. I think they need to dominate Tulsa to make a statement. Double digit win at least. We'll have to see. Moving on, we have number 14, SMU. They fell out of the rankings. They still did get a couple votes. I'm not sure how many. They did lose to UNLV, who was ranked 18th. They lost that by one touchdown, 24-17. And unfortunately, one of the teams had to take an early season loss, and just as a consequence, SMU wasn't ranked anymore. The rankings are very unforgiving right now, as the strength of all teams is, vastly unknown. So determining strength of schedule, that's hard to determine. Determining the strength of the actual team itself, that's hard to determine. A loss, wins and losses are pretty much the guiding principles of the AP poll. And it'll just take some later season adjustments to figure out, who's actually playing teams worthy of rankings later in the season. We'll just have to see where that goes. Jumping to number 15, Southern Miss. Southern Miss got embarrassed by Kentucky. Kentucky jumped to rank 17 after splattering Southern Miss 31-7. I think there are a few potential reasons this went down the way it did, including Kentucky might just be overlooked. They might be really good, and they seem like they could be. 31 points is very impressive, especially in this current game. I know a lot of you are used to like high-scoring college football games, but these are fresh programs. Every single program right now is fresh, built with primarily 2 and 3 stars. So there's just not going to be that offensive performance that you might expect. There's going to be incomplete passes, dropped passes, fumbles. I mean, all sorts of just chaos. But let's see what else might have caused this. Southern Miss, maybe just an off game. Early season. It's not a performance that they'll continue to have throughout the season. Maybe. And then what we might consider the most likely here, Southern Miss is overrated. I think that's probably a very likely candidate here. Just looking at their roster, looking at their talent, and saying this is the team that can succeed, and then not realizing that there are some flaws that we just didn't see, and we ranked them too high. We thought too highly of them, and then we watched them lose by 24 points. Yeah. So, in summary, I mean, Kentucky might be exceptionally good. And if Southern Miss just did have an off game, or if Kentucky just was really that good, they might actually be ranked as a result by the end of the season, depending on their conference and whatnot goes there. We'll just have to watch them, but it does look like they might not be as good as we had originally thought. Now, moving on to the last number 17 got replaced, UCLA. UCLA, they fell 7-13 against UTSA on the road. It's hard to say a lot about this game, other than the fact I think the UCLA offense did not perform where everybody thought it would. And while it was a decent enough performance by the defense, holding them to just 13 points, you still have to put up points of your own to win the game. I mean, that's just common sense. But UCLA, the Bruins, I wouldn't say they were embarrassed. I think they just had a rough game. Maybe UTSA is good. Maybe they just need to figure out something on offense. Who knows? I was pretty surprised by this next one here. Number 19 Wake Forest lost in overtime to number 3 Colorado State. And not only did this knock them out of the rankings, it also resulted in them not getting a single vote in the AP poll. Like I said, losses are very dangerous right now, no matter the circumstances. And if Colorado State is worthy of high ranking, I can easily see Wake Forest having the talent to put their season back together, as that could very well be their toughest game they'll have to play all season. But just getting knocked out with 0 votes after losing in overtime to a top 3 team, I don't know. That's just a little harsh, I think. But I think Wake Forest can easily bring it back. They just have to rack up 2, 3 more wins, and they'll probably be back in the rankings in no time. Maybe one win if they really step it up. We'll just have to see where Wake Forest ends up. But actually, something similar happened to number 21 Baylor, who lost in overtime 17-20 against number 6 North Carolina State. They also fell out of the rankings with the loss, but they did manage to squeeze in a single vote. I believe one person had them ranked at 25. I don't know how they technically ranked higher than Wake Forest, but I mean that's just the way it goes sometimes. Maybe people see a little bit more talent despite being ranked low or losing to a lower ranked team. Who knows? I think both of these teams have the talent to bring it back later in the season, almost guaranteed. So I'm not too worried about it right now. I'm sure getting knocked out of the rankings doesn't feel good, but they did have to play some really tough opponents in their first out of conference. Moving on, number 22, Utah State. They fell in a pretty clean game against North Carolina, 24-29. There isn't much to be said about it. I think Utah State is a solid team, but maybe North Carolina got overlooked a little bit. The Tar Heels haven't found themselves in the rankings, but if they can perform against Oklahoma State in week 2 or be undefeated coming out of week 3, I think they have a good chance at finding themselves in the top 25 by that point. Week 2, 3, I would say if they are not ranked undefeated by week 3, then week 4 almost guaranteed. And our final loss, not technically the most embarrassing, but they had it rough. Our final loss comes from number 24 BYU. I believe the graphic actually reads wrong. I can't remember. I think the graphic says number 23. Number 24 BYU, who had it rough. They had it rough. Tulane stomped them 27-7. But a loss is not the worst thing that happened to BYU. Getting so fully throttled is not the worst thing that happened to this team. BYU, they lost their running back for 4 weeks in this game. But that's not all. They also lost an offensive lineman for 2 weeks. They also lost a safety for 1 week. And to top it all off, after just 11 passes, they lost their quarterback, Rutger Wiggins, for 4 weeks. BYU might have had the talent to succeed initially, but losing so much so early, especially your number one guy, probably has them in a very bad position going forward. Now, I feel like if BYU was properly ranked here, they probably should have done a little better than they did, even without a quarterback or their safety or their O-line and the running back. Maybe they should have been a little bit more strong on defense. And I can see their offense slowing down by losing those. But I don't know. They look pretty rough. Well, we'll just have to watch them and see how this goes, I guess. But now let's continue moving through here. And with all this being said, let's quickly look at the 8 previously unranked teams who made it into the rankings. The top of them is number 14 Notre Dame, who I really like this season. Okay, that's all I'm going to say, at least for now. But Johnny Hill and Adam Knox are a perfect quarterback and wide receiver combo. And I think Notre Dame is going to be a serious threat this season. We'll leave it at that. We'll see how they do. Just keep an eye on them. Coming in at number 17, we have Kentucky after routing Southern Miss. If they continue to do that, I think they easily get into the top 10 after maybe just like 1-2 more weeks. They easily break top 10. From unranked, by the way. Keep that in mind. All of these teams were not ranked. Number 18 is Appalachian State. Just had a solid 23-7 win against Wisconsin. They either look promising or Wisconsin is just a bad team. We'll begin to see here in the upcoming weeks if they can keep up the sort of dominance they had against Wisconsin. And then, of course, we'll watch Wisconsin as well to kind of see where they are. They might just be a mediocre, not even mediocre. I mean, that is kind of just a horrible stat line. But App State looks strong. Western Michigan, they jumped to number 20 after a 31-10 win over Hawaii. I think that Maybe Hawaii isn't the best test. They don't look great. But considering the scores of most of the games in week one, 31 points is still impressive. So, Western Michigan, I think they're deserving of at least some votes here, some consideration in the AP poll, but they actually did manage to make it, and we'll just have to see how they continue to perform, especially when we get into conference play. Number 21, we have Iowa, who just nearly shut out Nevada. So close, 18-3, and Nevada got a field goal with under a minute to play. Of course, we saw Iowa solid play on offense and defense. We'll have to see if it holds up. We'll have to see if Nevada was a true test for Iowa. But Iowa's found themselves in the rankings after a really solid performance. Moving on, number 22 is Tulane. I won't get too far into detail on, but after blowing out a ranked BYU team, I think it's fair to get their slot here. We'll watch them and see if they can continue to do that to other teams. That's about all I have to say. They dominated. Our second to last team, we have Georgia State. They blew out Clemson 28-10 to take the number 23 slot. I didn't have super high expectations for the Tigers this season. I didn't really make an exact prediction for them. I would probably expect them to maybe go positive, maybe 0.500. But honestly, when I was looking at the initial sort of rosters, my personal preseason poll, I was considering Clemson for a little while. They did get pushed out as I just looked at more teams, and eventually I just kind of assumed they would totally fall out, and they look like they are going to, because Georgia State just dominated them start to finish. And our final edition at number 25 is Georgia beat Troy 20-3. Very similar situation to Iowa, but I think most consider Nevada to be a better team than Troy, at least for the moment. So Georgia's performance wasn't quite as noted. Still a great defensive performance, and I do want to see what they can do in this loaded Southeastern Conference, which again, I am going to get into. Speaking of the loaded SEC, let's jump topics here and look at how the conference has performed overall in week one. The American Athletic, or the AAC, they went just about even as you can get, really, with odd number of teams. They had 5 wins and 6 losses. They look about mediocre. SMU and Tulane probably showing the most potential right now. It's hard to gauge an entire conference, but SMU just had a rough week, and Tulane, we just saw what they did to BYU. I know Tulane keeps getting brought up, so we'll move on. We'll go to the ACC. They went exactly even at 7-7, but I do see improvements from this conference if a few teams can perform better than their week one games. They have a few solid looking teams right now that just might have yet to prove themselves, and of course, they have Miami. And if Miami can step it up after barely making it by Army, then I think we have a very solid ACC. The Big 12. Wow. Okay. I know I was talking about them highly earlier. The Big 12 went 3-7. Truly just horrible record. I don't think there's a way around that, but I also think they had it the worst out of all of the conferences. Of their 7 losses, 4 of them were to ranked opponents, and all of them were top 10 ranked opponents. The conference looks bad right now, but I think it might be clouded by the games they had to play, so we'll just keep some of the teams in mind. Like I said, Baylor was one of those losses, and Baylor looks good. They lost to a top 6 team, North Carolina State. So keep watching them. Move to the Big Ten. They come in with our first positive record at 8-6. They looked solid enough with some high-ranked teams for the moment, but I don't think it's all as clean as it looks. We'll just have to wait and see. They looks like some iffy teams. We'll just have to really watch them and see if these teams continue to perform. Let's jump down to Conference USA. They went the exact inverse at 6-8. Aside from FAU, the conference doesn't look particularly strong right now. unless North Texas can step up, or if UTSA is good. And FAU, by the way, they got plagued by some injuries, so we'll just have to see if they can continue performing without some of their players. Let's go to the Mid American Conference, or the MAC. Uh, MACtion, people like to say. They went 5-7, which doesn't sound great, but 4 of their 5 winning teams look pretty good, and I think those 4 or 5 um, teams can carry this entire conference. I really do. So we'll just have to see. Like I said, they have some really notable ranked teams right now. Just keep an eye out. Don't underestimate. Let's go to the Mountain West. They went 4-8, and honestly, it looks like one of the weaker conferences right now. They have Colorado State and UNLV, but if I'm honest, I personally have questions about both of these teams. We'll have to see. I know Colorado State down a ranked team, and even if they are overrated, they still took down what was it, Wake Forest. So they have a reputation. I still think there's just something off about them right now. We'll wait and see. The Pac-12, they went 5-7. Their only notable team right now really is USC. I think there are a couple other teams who might perform as the season moves on, bring some strength to the conference. Maybe Oregon immediately comes to mind. They have some really strong quarterback play. We'll just have to we'll wait and see. Like I keep saying, a lot of this stuff we have to wait and see. We have to get there when we get there. I'm gonna skip the SEC alphabetically here, just so you can hear the statistic at the very end because it is wild. Sun Belt went 6-4, and in my opinion, that's the biggest divide between the worst and best teams. Georgia Southern looked pretty downright awful, and Georgia State looked the exact opposite and incredible. It's hard to imagine a world where these teams do remotely similar. So, I don't know. I think there's just going to be a strong divide in this conference where you're going to see clear favorites and then teams that are just getting walked all over. Let's go to the independent teams. There's only 5 of them. They went 2-3. Liberty beating East Carolina, and Notre Dame putting on a show against Virginia Tech. Now, the awaited Southeastern Conference. SEC, where it just means more. The SEC went 13-1. 13 wins, 1 loss in out of conference play. That is a real number. 92.8% of the SEC won their game. You know how incredible that is? Fill in that blank that you see on that chart with 13-1 and compare it with all of the other numbers that are on that graphic right, and just see if anything comes close. The closest that comes to it in losses is Independence, who still had less wins than they had losses. Okay. We aren't talking about these teams beating FCS teams or Group of 5. Really, I mean, because there are none of either. FCS teams don't play them. In Group of 5, that hasn't really been determined yet. So everybody's kind of on that even playing field, or so you would think. But the SEC still dominated. LSU had to go in and ruin it for the SEC. They did lose 24-16 against Penn State, but other than that, every team won. I mean, you have Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, Florida, I think Mizzou, Mississippi State, all of them. They all won. Some had it closer, sure, but this conference already looks promising as a whole. So just imagine what the season in here is going to look like. A bunch of teams that have the ability and the capacity to do really well. I honestly think they're just going to beat up on each other. I think the SEC won't have nearly as many teams as they should near the top, simply because the conference is going to beat itself up. I mean, look at it right now. We have number 6, Texas A&M. Number 7, Arkansas. Number 8, Alabama. Number 17, Kentucky. And number 25, Georgia. These teams have so much talent and potential that it might actually work against them. Moving away from the teams, let's go ahead and look at some of the players here. Notre Dame's quarterback, Johnny Hill, won Player of the Week this week, throwing for 292 yards with 3 touchdowns. Hill completed 20 of 28 passes, which is 71.4%. And this stat line is insane by itself, but part of it should also be attributed to Adam Knox, the Notre Dame receiver. Like I said, I mentioned these guys earlier. Caught 4 passes for 92 yards and a touchdown. Exceptional play from the Irish. Now, I want to take a look at the exact opposite of success for some of these players and quickly discuss the injuries of some of the teams here. Talk about the effects they might have on some of these teams and on these teams' seasons. Obviously, BYU, they take the cake for the biggest loss in week 1. Rutger Wiggins went down in the game against Tulane with a minor concussion. He's going to be out 4 weeks. He will play again in week 6. So BYU won't have their starting quarterback against Georgia Southern, Ohio State, or Ole Miss. Luckily, they have a bye week in week 5 to avoid another game without him. So in the 4 weeks, he's only missing 3 games. I think Georgia Southern might be possible, but the other 2 are certainly risky, especially with Ole Miss currently having a top 10 offense in the league. And this isn't even mentioning the other 3 injuries they suffered. We'll just have to see if they can make it through those weeks before they get their quarterback. And if they get their quarterback back, we'll see if they can kind of recover. Tulsa, they also lost their quarterback, Bryce Dowdy. He also has a minor concussion and will also be returning in week 6. Tulsa, they have to play an angry Purdue at a neutral site. And then they have to play at USF versus Navy and then versus Tulane. The first and the last of these games should be very tough, especially without QB1. They'll get Dowdy back just in time to play at SMU, which might be absolutely necessary for Tulsa if SMU does turn out to be as good as they were projected. The final quarterback to go down in week 1 is UTEP's Billy Fenton, who is suffering from a fractured tibia and won't return until week 12, right before their rivalry game and conference championship game. Can UTEP really hang on that long without him? They have to play at North Texas and at FAU in this time, and versus Southern Miss can be a concern if they just had that week 1 flaw. It's going to be rough for the Miners. You don't have a quarterback for almost the entire season. That's just it's unfortunate. There are also 2 non-quarterback injuries I want to touch on. The first is one I've already covered a little bit. We have USC's running back Cooper Hunter. He tore through Texas very effectively, but he's now down for 2 weeks. I think Hunter's going to be direly missed versus Alabama in week 2. But I think USC can handle at Colorado in week 3. Their backup running back, Matty Barnett, he was okay for them. He lacks in speed, where Hunter was absolutely dominant, though. Cooper Hunter, I think he played a little over a quarter of the game. I want to see, just over a quarter maybe. And then Burnett played the other 2 in so many quarters. In this time, they put up nearly the exact same numbers. I think Hunter had actually a couple yards more. And it just shows how effective he was for USC on the ground. They might have to consider moving maybe Herbert Parsons from fullback to halfback for the weeks he's out, because Parsons is actually faster. Well, I mean, we'll have to see. And now, on a more serious note, our last injury is this week. Oregon lost Bertram McGraw, their wide receiver, to a fractured spine. His football career is certainly over, both in college and professionally. This was Oregon's second best but fastest receiver. He was in his junior year. He had an offseason left to develop. He could have had draft potential, and it is really a shame to see a play like this go down and to see a program lose a decent playmaker, especially this early in a season. So I feel for Oregon and McGraw. To move on to the final aspect of the post view, I want to take a look into the future. I wanted to see the hot takes of the week ranked on our scale of 0 to 100 degrees. Some might be hot takes, cold takes, maybe like room temperature takes. But let's just go ahead and dive right in. First, we'll have my personal prediction for the week. Actually, it's for the whole season, but week 1. I said the number 1 ranked team in the league will have 3 losses by the end of the regular season. So what exactly is this saying? The top ranked team, also known as what should be the best team in the nation, will have managed to lose 3 of 12 games, finishing at 9-3. Okay, so what would it take for this to happen? Of course, the team has to lose 3 games, but to be ranked number 1, there cannot be another team with more wins than that, hypothetically. So let's take a look at some things. First, each team is projected to win around 7 games simply based on the fact that each team is in a similar spot right now. That's just over half their games, and that's generally a pretty low number, 7-5. Of course, there are going to be many teams that get a couple less, maybe any less. And of course, the same thing for wins. Maybe, a couple more wins, maybe a lot more wins. Who knows? But in a world where teams are this even, can a team really dominate thoroughly enough to reach double-digit wins without picking up a recruiting class? This is just the rosters of 2 and 3 stars with those couple 4 and 5 stars mixed in there. So maybe I want to look at some potential losses for the current top 5 teams just to give an idea of how this might happen. For current number 1 Iowa State, they have week 2 Texas A&M, week 4 Texas, week 6 at Baylor, and week 13 at Iowa. Not to mention some sleeper candidates like Oklahoma, who competed with Alabama in week 5, and Oklahoma State in week 9. That's a challenging 6 games that they could very well drop. They didn't overperform in week 1, and if I were to pick 3 games they were going to drop, it would probably be Texas A&M, Texas, and at Iowa, at least for now. Can the Cyclones really go above .500 against these teams and then not drop any others all season for that 9-3 record? They listed 6. You go .500, that's 3 losses. That's 9-3. You cannot lose a single other game. Number 2, Ball State. They have week 2 at Northwestern, week 3 at Western Michigan, week 7 versus Central Michigan, week 11 versus Miami of Ohio. They all pose their challenges. That's a quick 4 games that they could drop, and of course the possibility of dropping a random game is in there too. I think they might be better than these teams. They might be able to scrape by, but the possibility is there. Number 3, Colorado State. They managed to squeeze by Wake Forest in week 1. And now follow it at a neutral site against North Texas and have week 9 against UNLV. Abbreviations. Colorado State is set up best schedule-wise to get double-digit wins if they have the talent that it is believed to do. If they don't, who knows? So they already took down Wake Forest. That was one of the tougher games. I think they can do it. It's not impossible. It's not impossible for any of these teams. It's not impossible for an unranked team. But, okay. Number 4, Nebraska. They play at Northwestern. They play at home Northwestern week 3. And then at Purdue in week 4. And at Iowa week 7. I think the Big Ten has more talent than we currently see, though. I think it is a little bit of a rocky conference, but I think there is still some undiscovered talent. So maybe there's like a couple like landmine sort of games to get onto this. You don't see it, and suddenly it just explodes right beneath you. Who knows? And our final, number 5, North Carolina State. Baylor was a tough one to win. They did do it in overtime. Week 3, you have at Wake Forest. Week 11, at North Carolina. Both of these stand out immediately. But I think there are also some teams yet to emerge in the ACC, especially the Atlantic. Won't get too far into them just in case I'm wrong. But the Coastal Division, they certainly have more talent for sure. And North Carolina State, I think, managed to evade two concerning teams. They have a good shot at double-digit wins as well, but I still think a lot has to go right for North Carolina State. So, all in all, I would rate this take at about 80 degrees. You know, a nice warm take. Definitely on the upper side of this. There are multiple teams with paths to 10 or more wins. I think there's like a fog over a lot of these paths, though. It makes everything a little blurry and hard to see, but not impossible. With 128 teams, there's a pretty solid chance that at least one of them reaches double digits. So it's not especially bold here, 80 out of 100, but I think the odds are definitely against it. Our next take comes from Lucas, who says Georgia Southern sneaks into the college football playoff and upsets their way to a national championship. First off, the word sneaks implies a decisive end of season game make the playoffs as a double digit seed. At least there's some rationale to this take, because everything else that has to happen, let's just take a look. In week 1, they had to play Texas A&M, which was a rough start for sure, having to play a top 10 team right off the bat, but getting shut out 17-0, not ideal for their image. I would argue the Aggies actually underperformed in this game. Georgia Southern's quarterback Spike Hendrickson threw 14 for 37, which is a 37.8 completion rate, with only 121 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. This is definitely the worst quarterback we've seen so far, and if you want me to believe he can turn it around and make playoffs, then, mind you, I'm only talking about making the playoffs. That's only 12 teams. I'm not talking about this upset turning around their no. I'm only talking about them making the playoffs right now. Now I'm not talking about they're upsetting their way to the national title. Okay, this is only about making the playoffs. And on top of that, this quarterback leads them to win 4 games in the playoffs against the best of the best. There is no way. But for good measure, let's go ahead. We'll see who they play in their schedule. Week 2 is a home and home versus BYU. They're away. BYU is down their starting quarterback and 3 other players, giving Georgia Southern a chance at getting this done if Hendrickson can outperform the BYU backup. How embarrassing of a question is that? Week 3 is home versus Arkansas State. They looked pretty good in week 1, but they probably aren't far off from being considered in the rankings if they keep winning. So Arkansas State, this is likely not a win. Week 4 is a bye, followed by week 5 versus Louisiana, who barely beat West Virginia week 1. This might be a toss-up game because we just don't know very much about them right now, but I think Louisiana could maybe be the favorite. It's probably a toss-up though. We can give it to Georgia Southern. Maybe. Right now, we'll see when we get there. Week 6 is at Troy, who just got embarrassed by Georgia. This could be winnable, but you cannot throw 5 interceptions to do it. 7 at ULM. They lost by 1 touchdown to number 2 Ball State. They seem like they could be solid enough, and they definitely look better than Georgia Southern. Loss. Week 8 versus Texas State. A leading offensive unit jumped into the top 10 after their week 1 dominance. This is the loss. Week 9 is at South Alabama, a sort of mystery team that didn't do too hot against Tennessee. This could be a win, but again, 5 interceptions, not the way to do it. Week 10 is home against Coastal Carolina. The Chanticleers shut out Rice 10-0 in week 1. They don't look too remarkable though. I think the odds are in favor of Coastal Carolina here, but there's a chance Georgia Southern could compete. Week 11 is at App State. App State jumped into the rankings based on their Week 1 performance. They look like a solid team if they continue this. Probably likely Georgia Southern pretty soundly. Week 12 is a rematch against BYU because of scheduling issues and BYU's independent status. It kind of makes everything a little gray. This is probably the last time that an independent has to play one team twice in the same season. But anyway, at this point, they should probably have their starting quarterback. And if they didn't win before, they'll likely do it here. So this is probably a loss. Then week 13, or their rivalry week, is against Georgia State. The same Georgia State who blew out Clemson in week 1. Jumping into the rankings immediately. That wasn't enough. So this should not be close, to be honest, and Georgia Southern should lose. So where does that place Georgia Southern in terms of wins and losses? I see Georgia Southern going around 5-7, but I can easily see 4-8. Some toss-ups are bound to go their way. Have some talent surrounding their quarterback, but 5-7 cannot make the playoffs. I put this at 100,000. This is a burning hot take and will stun literally everyone if this somehow happens. I mean, he did say upset, right? Yeah, I guess that makes it better. Give me 1 second. We will move on to our next take momentarily. All right, sorry about that. Our third take comes from W. Nathan. It says, the loss of BYU's starting players, reset of the roster, and bring out the talents of the lower string players. BYU lost 4 starters in 1 game. Lemuel Barrow, I cannot say this guy's name, is taking over at quarterback, but statistically, he is worse at everything than Rutger Wiggins was. Sky Richard was their second string halfback, so they still have Fleming Fish running the show on the ground. Their offensive lineman could probably be easily replaced. He's pretty far down on the depth chart, but I think Leonel Etheridge will be missed at safety. So the injuries at quarterback and safety are probably the biggest impacts. Barrow, he was not impressive in his first game replacement. He threw 13 for 23 with no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. I just can't see this being a step forward for BYU. This is a very hot take. 95 degrees. It's way up there. The fourth and final take comes from Lunar Apsis, who claims, despite a 12-team playoff, you will not see at least one team from each conference in the playoffs. Okay, so with 12 teams making the playoff and 10 conferences, rationally one would assume that at least one has to make it. The conference championship has to make the playoffs, leaving 2 slots for at-large bids. Let's go into some detail on the numbers here. The top 4 seeds are reserved for the top 4 conference champions. That takes out 4 conferences, leaving 6 left to get in, with 8 slots left in the playoffs. Now, we'll consider something I haven't even originally thought about. Let's assume that at least one independent team makes the playoffs. I think this is a fair assumption. We have Notre Dame, who looks promising. We have BYU, who might recover just in time to maybe make a run. Who knows about the others? I mean, we just saw Army compete with Miami, so there's hope. I mean, at least one of these teams should make it, right? So we'll say at least one independent makes it. That is now 7 slots, with 6 conferences still left to go. That means that if only one team that isn't the best and presumably the conference champion in their conference makes it, then we have all 10 conferences. But if there are 2 teams, presumably the conference runner-ups, that are better than other conferences' winner, then that's 9 out of 10 conferences. So if there are runner-ups of the, let's say, the SEC and the ACC are 2 teams that have auto bids. Okay, let's say Alabama wins the SEC, and let's say Miami wins the ACC. Then the runner-ups, let's say the runner-ups are Texas A&M and North Carolina State. If those 2 teams are better than a conference champion of, say, the MAC or I don't know, the Sun Belt, then that could be two conference champions that are missing, and that'll put them at 9 out of 10 conferences. I think this is very possible. I don't know if it's more likely to happen than not, but it's not the hottest take of all time. Uh, and honestly, I think I agree with you. I'd put this around maybe 70, 75 degrees. I mean, it's not that hot. I think this is very, very possible. And that concludes the week one post view segment. And to keep this somewhat shorter, we'll quickly run through the week two preview. Starting the game of the week, number 6 Texas A&M travels to Ames, Iowa, to take on the number 1 Iowa State Cyclones. This is sure to be a heated matchup. Two top 10 teams clashing in only the second week. I don't think this spells disaster for either team upon loss. I don't think either of them drop out of the rankings. I don't think either of them end up in the bottom 10. Maybe the bottom 10. Anyway, I don't think this spells disaster for either team on the line, but it definitely makes room for less errors. Okay, Texas A&M especially has to play the gauntlet that is also sometimes called the Southeastern Conference. I don't know if you've heard of it. There's very little room for mistakes there. But Iowa State isn't entirely off the hook either. Their conference includes Baylor, Texas, and Kansas, so they're in for their own struggles. Not to mention they play the newly ranked Iowa in rivalry week. If they live up to their potential this season, this game definitely means a lot to the teams here. But I think they're still going to have a chance at recovering their season if they lose. Let's look up some other notable matchups. I have 4 for you. We have UCLA at number 15 Miami. The Bruins just lost their ranking after falling to UTSA, and a win against Miami could potentially reestablish their reputation, whereas Miami is fighting to retain their rank. I don't even think a close win would harm their ranking. I do think a close win would harm their ranking because they barely beat Army the week prior, and I really only think they rose so high in the rankings because of all the teams that got dropped out. I don't think the Bruins are going to be ranked if they win this game. I don't think Miami's going to drop out of the rankings if they lose this game. But it still is high stakes. Starting off 0-2 as a preseason ranked team probably puts you in a bad position for the rest of the season. Maybe a little bit of a surprising one here. Number 24 versus Tulsa. Purdue. Purdue is barely hanging on in the rankings after their week 1 loss. I think they're very lucky to be ranked right now at all. To maintain that, they definitely need to win by double digits. There isn't much else to say about this. Boilermakers are in a bad position. A win right here. There might be other talented teams that replace them. Absolutely need to make a statement here. Number 19, North Texas versus number 3, Colorado State. If these teams had both won, this could be the game of the week. Iowa State, Texas A&M is a very big game, but that could be number 3 versus number 4. Because as some of you might have forgotten, North Texas was ranked 4th in the preseason poll just to get upset by Vanderbilt in week 1. Colorado State has maintained their rank at 3. But if North Texas has recovered to the level we thought they would be at, Colorado State could be in trouble. It could. And our last game here. Number 16 USC versus number 8 Alabama. What really needs to be said about this one? USC toppled the Longhorns week 1 as the Crimson Tide struggled a little bit against Oklahoma. USC has a very tough out-of-conference lineup, having to take on Texas, which they won, Alabama, and then Notre Dame in week 13. Both of these teams are looking to make a statement with this game. But keep in mind, USC is down their running back, Cooper Hunter, right now. So their ground game is going to be a little weaker. Alabama, they have a strong, solid lineup. They did have a struggle win. USC did dominate. Alabama is favored right now. I believe the line is Bama favored by 3.5, so it's very close. We'll just have to see how it goes. And on that note, friends, we're reaching the end of the show. We've covered rankings, conferences, players, injuries, some hot takes, and then a very brief rundown of week 2 games. Thanks for watching. I'm the Maple Mango. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you next week. Bye.